Yeah, now we are going to continue our small conversation on the basics of double taxation treaties or double taxation agreements or double taxation conventions, however you are willing to call them. And in the last video, I told you already that a double taxation treaty never contains any individual details on the case, but just tells you into which law or tax act you have to look. So if the legislation of country A or of country B is the one which you can look at. So it only says which state is allowed to apply its laws to which case and which not. Now let's go to another subsequent question. That is, how binding is such a double taxation treaty in practice? So if something is written in a double taxation treaty, is it really absolutely binding for a state? So if there's something written in a DTT, is this hammered into stone or could it be circumvened by a state? And for an answer to that question, we need to think about the legal nature of a double taxation treaty. And well, the legal nature is, at least in many, many constitutional frameworks of states, that it has no specific legal nature. So you heard probably about European Union law that has a specific legal nature. It overrules any conflicting national law. It is a specific type of law. It has automatic prevalence under all circumstances. And that is not the case, especially not the case with double taxation treaties and other international agreements. The usual international contract, international agreement between two states has no specific legal character. So when two states form an agreement, this is first a sheet of paper. Then it's signed by the governments, but usually under the condition of later ratification by Parliament. So this is still not a binding text. It only becomes binding by Parliament's consent to the text of that agreement. And that consent in many legal frameworks, for example in the German one, that consent takes the form of a law, a simple and plain law. We, the Federal Bundestag of Germany, hereby order that the text of the agreement, let's say with the USA on taxation, is to be treated as a law in Germany. So whatever is written there after parliamentary consent is treated as a legal rule of the same nature as the legal rules in the Income Tax Act, in the Corporation Tax Act, in the Trade Tax Act. Now you know, then you will have that specific situation that, for example, one legal rule, Income Tax Act, says you have to pay taxes on your whole worldwide income, there is no exception. And then you have, by the fact that the Double Taxation Treaty USA has got the character of a law, a second legal rule which says your factory profit from the US is not taxable in Germany. That's the usual situation. Two legal rules conflict. And for this usual legal situation, there are standard traditional rules. And one is you have special rules for special cases, and you have general rules which apply in general. But they are always kicked away if there is a special rule for this specific situation, because a specific rule written for a specific situation only makes sense if the legislator wants to get away from the general rule for this specific situation. For example, if you say nobody is allowed to park here his car, well, that's a general rule. Now, if you want to give firemen permission to park there or to stop their car there in order to save a burning house. You would naturally write into some law on the activities of firemen, or better fire persons, or however you call them nowadays, that firemen in the case of an emergency have naturally the right to park their fire cars everywhere. So firefighters can do that everywhere. That's a specific law, and it naturally only makes sense if you want to override a general law. The same is here. The double taxation rules are special rules written for cross-border situations in certain specific countries. So if a double taxation treaty says the US profit is out of German taxation, and the ESDG also a simple legal rule says worldwide income, then the DTT is the specific rule and it wins. It gets prevalence in the application. So two laws of equal rank. Income tax is a parliamentary law, and DTT in Germany is a parliamentary law, stand in conflict, and the more specific one wins. That is even clarified by a special rule or by rule in the German General Tax Code, paragraph 2 AO, paragraph 2 of the General Tax Code. The Abgabenordnung says that international agreements on taxation take prevalence over the normal tax laws. But that is only a clarification. It would have been true even if you completely eliminate that paragraph 2. Nevertheless, this rule makes a bit of sense because there is also another conflict-solving rule in science of law, because the other rule is a later law beats an older law. The younger law beats the older law. What the legislator told you recently has more weight than what they told you 10 years ago. The idea is naturally when you get a command by a boss, later the boss gives you a new command which contradicts the former one. What your boss told you last counts. That's the same here. Now, one might say, if the Income Tax Act is re-edited and republished with again mentioning the worldwide income, one might say that is a legal command of yesterday. And the double taxation treaty with France has its origin from 1959. So younger law wins over older law, and that is why paragraph 2AO makes sense. They wanted to clarify that in a case of a double taxation treaty, these rules are always meant as a special law, and so that you can't argue with my new publication or my new edition of the Income Tax Act again speaks of the worldwide income without mentioning the exception for the US factory. So that's outdated. No, that's wrong. The idea is usually a double taxation treaty has to be treated as a special law. That's it. But that's the only reason why it takes prevalence, what you find there. So what does that mean? Well, a special law is only a law, like any other law. So you could change it. You could say it's no longer valid as national parliament. You could also overrule it partly by other legislation. So, for example, if you do that clearly enough, you could say general principle, the worldwide income is taxable. Specific exception, the US factory income is tax-free in Germany, look DTT. And then you might later say, what if somebody does there, let's say it's a factory producing drugs and weapons of mass destructive character. And now if you wanted to revoke the tax exemption for that, you see that's a rather idiotic idea, idiotic example. But imagine now a political debate came up, then you could say, okay, a drug factory for forbidden drugs like cocaine and other things should not profit from the DTT. That if you wanted to do this, you could do it just by issuing a law. In contrast to the DTT provision, we specifically for these things say there should be no exemption, but there should be taxation. Because a general rule can be overridden by or is put aside by a specific law, and a more specific law can put aside the law for the specific situation. Firefighters can park everywhere as long as they are in an emergency situation. That overrides the rule nobody is allowed to park here. But now it might be that the firefighters more often can get in conflict with the police forces. And so you might even say, but firefighters are not allowed to park everywhere if the police is parking or willing to park at a certain location. This would be a more specific exception for from the specific situation. The same is in principle possible for taxation. You could say the factory in the USA is tax exempt, specific law. And then you could also say in an additional law, in contrast to that, what we said in the DTT, certain factories are not, or in certain constellations they are not. So it would be legally possible under the Constitution to override rules in a DTT by another more specific law. It will be rare, but it is possible and from the legal framework. So to say it in plain words, the obligations which you take in a double taxation treaty can be broken by a state. You can override a DTT rule because you signed it to the other state, but the signature itself has no legal effect. Only the law made by Parliament gives the treaty with the other state a legal effect internally in the legal framework of your own state. And so by another law, you could break the DTT rules. You could deprive them of their inner state effect. So breaking a DTT obligation is internally possible. You can order by a law all your courts, your officials and others, and your taxpayers to disregard certain parts of an international agreement in certain cases. That is effectively possible. In America, the right to a treaty override is regarded as given by the Constitution. In Germany, the Constitutional Court has also ruled that Parliament's power to give orders in contrast to an international agreement's obligation is possible, always with the exception that this is not possible with regard to EU law, because there EU law has explicitly set up supranational effects. You can't breach it. But all other international agreements, that is possible. In the normal situation, however, you can expect that international agreements will be followed faithfully and will not be breached. So such a treaty override only happens in extraordinary situations. For example, when you sign a treaty and later find out that what you signed there brings in a very specific situation complete nonsense along, or a complete catastrophe, things which you never dreamed of and which will, in your imagination, ruin the whole civilization and the whole world. In that case, you might be willing to say, okay, specific legal provisions now in a law, in contrast to what we promised the Americans, we are going to override the treaty in the specific situation. Now, you probably can't imagine why that should be done and how. How is it possible that people sign a treaty and afterwards say that there is an outcome which is so outrageous that we must abstain from fulfilling the treaty in situations like these in the future. So just to illustrate what could happen, a famous case from the 1990s. Um, I'm not telling you which bank it has been which was involved. Let's just call it the Commerzbank case, because naturally it was the Commerzbank which was involved. So the famous Commerzbank case worked as follows. There was Commerzbank AG, a German bank, and the Commerzbank had set up a permanent establishment in the United Kingdom. And well, what does a bank do? They give credits, and sometimes they give cross-border credits. So this PE, permanent establishment in the UK, gave a credit to a customer in the USA. And the customer naturally does what the people who take a loan do. They paid interest. Now, you should also pay some interest to what follows, because there were now 3 states involved, and they all had international agreements, double taxation treaties. The double taxation treaty Germany-UK said Germany may not tax the profit which belongs to the activity of the PE in the UK. So Germany was completely out of the taxation with regard for that interest. Now there was also a double taxation treaty Germany-US, which said interest which is paid from the US to a German recipient is not allowed to be taxed in the US. So the US said, sorry, we are out. And now the double taxation treaty between the UK and the US was also a bit old and was not fully prepared for the world of today. So the DTT UK US said interest paid by an American can only be taxed in the UK if the recipient is a resident of the UK. And now the PE said, we are not a taxpayer. We are just a branch. We are just a permanent establishment owned by somebody else, and that somebody else is a resident not of the UK, but of Germany. And so the UK is not allowed under the treaty UK-US to tax the interest which we got from our American customer. So the UK was out, and that led to the interesting outcome that with regard to that interest payment in that 3 states constellation, all the 3 states were out. That was entirely unforeseen. And you can now imagine what happens if you successfully get away with that. Let's say 100,000 interest payment from the US to the UK PE happen to successfully remain untaxed. What happens next year? It's clear what happens next year. Next year you do the same thing with more US customers and with 100 million. And next year, after next year, all other banks worldwide see that and say, oh my God, that's so attractive. So 2 years later, probably 3 or 100 trillion of interest payments are arranged in that constellation. And so you have a big, big, deep hole where all tax revenue worldwide drops in. Oh, this is the Bermuda Triangle of taxation. If you don't do anything against this, all the money of the world will vanish there and pop up again as so-called white income, legally untaxed revenue. So what could you do now? You could change all these treaties. That takes years. Or you could just say, okay, when we see that constellation, somebody has to show some courage, jump forward and say, I'm going to fight now and breach my treaty obligations, irrespective of the moral implications. I am going to save the world and breach the treaty. So here, in such a constellation, you would probably, you could make a bet that one of the 3 states will probably breach its treaty obligations. For example, you could expect, I didn't know how it worked out later, but I would expect, for example, that the British say, in contrast to our treaty obligations, we just now make a law that in contrast to what the treaty says, in this constellation, we tax the interest revenue of the permanent establishment from that interest. And now the only person who could legally complain is not the taxpayer. Why? Commerzbank AG was not a contract partner of the DTTs. They just got rights under the local laws. So if the local law is changed when Parliament in the UK says we do no longer follow our obligations, or our promises which we gave to the US, then there has been broken no promise which was made to Commerzbank AG. The only people who could complain would probably be the US. And now imagine, will they do it? Will really the US ambassador knock on the door of Buckingham Palace, or better of Downing Street 10, and then say, hello, knock, knock, I want to hand in a complaint. You broke the treaty and saved the world against tax-saving models. So in that case, probably the others would say, thank God that somebody did it. It might be that a diplomat said, we should not establish a tradition that treaties should be broken without a protest. We should make a protest. If that really happens, somebody has that understanding of tax law, that let's say the US embassy finds out they broke our treaty, then they would probably complain in a very specific way. Good morning, I'm here at Downing Street 10 in order to tell you that I have been ordered, so you can distance yourself a bit from that, I have been ordered to protest against what you did, because it's not nice to breach treaties. And by the way, while we are just at it, my fiscal minister told me to greet very, very, very nicely your fiscal ministry, and to congratulate them on their usually very excellent work. And I hope that in the future our good relations will never be impacted. And I have to assure you that the American people stays the best friends which the UK will ever have. And so you would, on the other side, exactly know what to do with that protest. Open the waste bin and throw it in. They just did it for formal reasons, to keep up the idea that treaties should be kept, but they agreed fully with what you did. So that is something which you must know when you have the idea that with excellent cleverness, if you do something where you look to the wording of 14 different tax treaties and you combine them in a way that in the end the result is an outrage from the perspective of every fiscal officer in the world, you cannot really trust that these treaty obligations will then be kept in the long run by all taxation authorities involved. You have probably to expect change of the national legislation in one of the countries involved, only for constellations for which the treaties really were meant, for bona fide constellations, which you entered in good faith and which they would also accept as this is something which we regard as okay. And that is what we wanted to bring along with the treaty rules. Then you can really expect that even in the long run, these treaties are kept. So what you need to know is when you analyze a treaty and you have the idea, well, it's written there, I have a claim. And in contrast to what comes out, and if that's good or bad, this is the law and the law stands. You must know the specific nature of international law. An international treaty is something which is made voluntarily by a sovereign state, and it's only kept voluntarily by the sovereign state. And juridically, you cannot enforce the fulfillment of an international treaty against the will of that state in that state court. Only if the constitution of that state allows you that, and no reasonable state will do that, apart from the case of EU law. No state ever says we sign an international treaty where we refrain from our sovereignty. And so you cannot rely that things which are treaty rules which produce, when cleverly combined, a completely unforeseeable and unforeseen outcome, that this stands in the long run. What you can expect, perhaps, is that when you design such a clever idea like the Commerzbank model, that it was, that you can succeed in court when it comes to quarrel about this specific case in that specific year, because then it might be that the court says, okay, the law is rubbish, but as it stands at the moment, or as it stood at the time, yes, it ordered completely to let you tax-free. So you could win probably for 1 year, but after you have won, it is expectable that then the laws will be changed. Naturally, as you cannot increase tax burdens under the most constitutions for the past, then the change will come for the future. So you could make some prey finding such loopholes if you win in court, but probably the perspective is not that you can continuously do this for the future too, because once you detected the loophole and it stood critique in court and you won, you can expect that then the laws will be changed. And constitutionally, this will be possible in most states of the earth for the reasons which I explained. International treaties are made voluntarily, and they are kept only voluntarily. And if somebody breaches them, the only person in quotation marks, which could complain is the other state, and the other state will not do so. And the other state also has no legal remedies against the breach of the obligations. Nobody is going to wage a war because a double taxation treaty has been broken in a very specific and limited way. So that is something which you need to understand. A treaty override is possible in principle. So, yeah, there might always be rules in a DTT where if a very, very surprising outcome happens, there might be in the future, or even from the past already, if somebody else also had that good idea, there might be overriding legislation. Okay, this is again enough for this chapter. Thank you for watching. Come back soon. Enjoy the time in between. Recommend the channel, press a like button, and so on. You know that what every YouTube video always says at the beginning, at the end, and everywhere in between. Okay, so I just say goodbye and see you again soon. Ciao.